Ethan Cole's truck rumbled down the narrow dirt road, the tires kicking up a trail of dust as it wound through the dense forest. The canopy overhead blocked out most of the afternoon sunlight, casting long, ominous shadows across the path. The further he drove, the more isolated he felt. The GPS on his dashboard blinked and lost signal miles back, leaving him to rely on the outdated map he'd been given at the park headquarters. Station 21, he muttered to himself, double-checking the map. It was the last stop on his route, a remote ranger outpost in the heart of Greystone National Park. Known for its ancient, towering trees and treacherous terrain, the park was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. Ethan had been a park ranger for nearly a decade, and while he'd worked in some of the most isolated and rugged areas, nothing had prepared him for the unsettling feeling that crept over him as he neared Station 21. The radio crackled with static, the last trace of human contact fading away. He tapped it out of habit, but the noise only grew worse before cutting out entirely. He was alone now, just him and the forest. After what felt like hours, the trees parted, revealing a small clearing where Station 21 stood. The outpost was modest, a wooden cabin with a sagging roof and a weathered porch, flanked by an old lookout tower. A faded sign on the front read, Station 21, in peeling letters. The place had seen better days. Ethan parked the truck and stepped out, the air cool and damp against his skin. The silence was overwhelming. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled, not even the sound of a distant stream. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He shook off the uneasy feeling and grabbed his bags, walking up to the cabin. The door creaked open with a loud groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight that filtered through the grime-covered windows. The cabin was sparsely furnished, a battered desk, a small kitchen area, a cot in the corner, and a radio set that looked as ancient as the building itself. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the air had a musty smell like it hadn't been aired out in years. Ethan dropped his bags near the cot and surveyed the room. He noticed a stack of papers on the desk, topped with a folded note. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. Ethan, if you're reading this, then you've taken over for me. I'm sorry. I didn't have time to explain everything before I left, and even if I did, you wouldn't believe me. Stay vigilant. This place, it's not like the others. Keep the doors locked at night. Don't go into the woods after dark, no matter what you hear. And whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers. Good luck. You're going to need it. Mason. The name rang a bell. Mason Hadley was the previous ranger stationed at 21. He'd been here only a few months before, suddenly resigning without any explanation. Ethan had thought nothing of it at the time. Burnout was common in this line of work, especially in such remote locations. But now, with the ominous note in his hand, a chill ran down his spine. Ethan looked around the cabin again, noticing the small things he hadn't before. The way the furniture was slightly off-kilter, as if it had been moved hastily. The deep scratches on the wooden floor near the door, and the fact that the curtains were drawn tightly shut, even in the middle of the day. He set the note down and moved to the desk, rifling through the papers. Most of them were routine reports, but a few caught his attention. They were logs from Mason, detailing odd occurrences, missing hikers, strange sounds in the night, and sightings of something moving through the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing. Each entry was more desperate than the last until they abruptly stopped. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd heard rumors about Station 21 before taking the assignment, stories about strange things in the woods, about how it was cursed or haunted. He dismissed them as campfire tales, the kind of stories passed around to scare the rookies. But now, standing in the cabin with the silence pressing in on him from all sides, he wasn't so sure. He decided to take a walk around the perimeter, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. Grabbing his hat and flashlight, he stepped outside. The late afternoon light was already fading, casting long shadows across the clearing. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches intertwined like the gnarled fingers of an old witch. Ethan walked the perimeter, noting the old, rusted traps set up around the station, probably to keep animals away, though they looked like they hadn't been checked in years. The woods were thick and dense, the kind of place where someone could easily get lost and never be found. He caught himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, feeling that same prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like he was being watched. As he neared the edge of the clearing, something caught his eye, a series of deep, claw-like marks gouged into the trunk of a tree. The marks were old, the bark grown over in places, but they were unmistakably the result of something large and powerful. He reached out to touch them, the bark rough under his fingers. What kind of animal had made these? And why here, so close to the station? A sudden rustling in the bushes made him spin around, his hand instinctively going to the flashlight on his belt. But there was nothing there. Just the wind, he told himself. Or maybe a deer. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. He made his way back to the cabin, a growing sense of unease settling over him. Inside, he locked the door behind him and turned on the old radio set, but all he got was static. He tried the satellite phone next, but the line was dead. Just great, he thought, isolated and cut off. Ethan sat down on the cot, pulling Mason's note from his pocket and reading it again. Stay vigilant. Don't go into the woods at night. Don't listen to the whispers. What had Mason meant by whispers? The phrase lingered in his mind as the light outside faded completely, leaving the cabin in darkness save for the weak glow of a single lantern. He was exhausted, but sleep seemed impossible with the weight of the note and the strange atmosphere pressing down on him. The first night at Station 21 stretched on endlessly. Every creak of the wooden walls, every gust of wind outside made Ethan tense, his mind racing with the possibilities of what could be out there in the dark. He tried to tell himself that it was just his imagination, but deep down he knew there was something more, something in the woods, something that had been watching him since the moment he arrived. He lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, Mason's final words echoing in his mind. Good luck. You're going to need it. As sleep finally claimed him, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had driven Mason to leave in such a hurry was now watching him, waiting for its chance to make itself known. Ethan awoke to the sound of rain tapping against the cabin's tin roof, the steady rhythm both soothing and unsettling. He lay still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the grime-covered windows. The events of his first day at Station 21 replayed in his mind. The ominous note from Mason, the eerie silence, the claw marks on the tree. It had been a restless night filled with strange dreams that left him more exhausted than before. The radio remained silent, the satellite phone still dead. He had planned to contact headquarters first thing this morning. But without communication, he felt as though he was cut off from the rest of the world, isolated in this forgotten corner of the park. It didn't help that Station 21 felt more like a relic of the past than an operational outpost. Everything was worn, outdated, as if it had been abandoned long ago. Ethan pushed himself out of bed, splashed his face with cold water from the basin, and tried to shake off the lingering unease. He had a job to do. If he let every creak and shadow get to him, he'd never make it through the season. After a quick breakfast of canned beans and coffee, he checked his map. Today, he was scheduled to patrol the northern section of the park, a dense, hilly area that was notorious for its difficult terrain. He strapped on his gear, including the bear spray and hunting knife that now felt more essential than ever, and stepped out into the rain. The forest was shrouded in mist, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The undergrowth was thick and wet, making each step heavy and deliberate. As he walked, he kept his eyes on the ground, searching for any sign of the missing hiker. Though no one had filed an official report, a group of campers had mentioned seeing a man heading north on the main trail several days ago. Since then, there had been no trace of him. Ethan followed the trail as it wound through the woods, the rain growing heavier, obscuring the landscape. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches dripping with moisture, the ground beneath turning to mud. The mist hung thick and low, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. After an hour of walking, he came to a small clearing where the trail split into two. A faded sign pointed to a scenic overlook, but something else caught Ethan's attention. A set of footprints, barely visible in the soft earth, leading off the trail and into the trees. He crouched down to examine them, noting that they were fresh, likely made within the last day or so. The prints were deep, as if the person had been running, or perhaps struggling against the thick mud. But why would anyone veer off the main trail here, especially in this weather? His instincts told him to follow them. The footprints led him deeper into the forest, where the trees grew even denser, their branches entwining like twisted, gnarled fingers. The further he went, the more he noticed signs of a struggle: broken branches, disturbed earth, patches of foliage that had been trampled flat. It was as if something had dragged the person through the woods, but there were no other tracks, no sign of an animal. Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The silence that had been unsettling before now felt oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. He pressed on, the mist swirling around him, distorting shapes and sounds. Then he saw it. Just ahead, the ground was torn up in a wide circle, the dirt churned as if something had burrowed out of the earth. In the center lay a single, mud-splattered boot, half buried and abandoned. Ethan's stomach tightened as he knelt to pick it up. It was heavy, the laces frayed, the sole worn thin from years of use. But it was the dark, reddish stain on the side that made his heart race. Blood. A sudden rustling in the bushes made him whip around, his hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray. But there was nothing. Only the trees, the mist, and the rain. He scanned the area, his senses on high alert, but saw no movement, no sign of what had caused the disturbance. Still, the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just out of sight, was stronger than ever. He quickly radioed in his find, but as expected, the static greeted him in response. The idea of turning back crossed his mind, but he knew he couldn't leave without finding out what had happened. He had to keep going, despite the gnawing fear in his gut. Ethan moved cautiously now, every step calculated, his ears straining for any sound beyond the patter of rain. He continued to follow the trail of disturbed earth and broken branches, the sense of dread growing with each passing minute. The path eventually led him to a narrow ravine, its edges slick with mud. The footprints stopped at the edge, but there was something else. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree were strange, intricate symbols. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, more akin to ancient runes than any modern writing. The lines were sharp and deliberate, almost as if they had been etched with a precise tool, not by natural forces or even an animal. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he traced the symbols with his finger, the bark cold and damp to the touch. The symbols seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent energy, and as he stared at them, he could swear he heard a faint whisper, just on the edge of his perception, a soft, sibilant sound that sent shivers through his entire body. He stepped back, shaken. This was no ordinary disappearance. Something far more sinister was at work here, something that went beyond the realm of what he could easily explain. The symbols, the boot, the disturbed ground, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The hiker hadn't simply gotten lost, he had been taken. As Ethan turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from all directions at once. He froze, his pulse quickening. The growl was unlike anything he'd ever heard, deep, resonant, and filled with a primal anger that sent his instincts screaming to run. But he didn't run. He couldn't. If there was one thing he had learned from years of working in the wilderness, it was that running was the surest way to provoke a predator. Instead, he slowly backed away from the edge of the ravine, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The growl came again, closer this time, reverberating through the trees. Ethan could feel the vibrations in his chest, as if the sound itself was pressing down on him, suffocating him with its intensity. His mind raced as he tried to pinpoint the source, but the mist and the dense underbrush made it impossible. Then, in the periphery of his vision, he saw it, a large, shadowy figure moving through the trees, too indistinct to make out details but unmistakably massive. It moved with a fluidity that was almost unnatural, its form shifting and undulating as it melted into the mist. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure, watching in a mixture of terror and fascination as it circled the clearing, always staying just out of clear view. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, dissolving into the mist like a wraith. The growl faded into the distance, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to weigh on Ethan's shoulders. He exhaled shakily, realizing he had been holding his breath. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it was still out there, somewhere in the forest, watching him. With his heart pounding in his chest, Ethan forced himself to turn and make his way back to Station 21. The forest seemed even darker and more foreboding than before, the mist thicker, the shadows deeper. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set his nerves on edge, but he pushed on, refusing to look back. By the time he reached the cabin, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky was still a dull gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. Ethan slammed the door shut behind him, locking it for good measure. He leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing, his mind racing with what he had seen. He knew one thing for sure: the hiker wasn't coming back, and whatever had taken him was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Ethan glanced at Mason's note, still lying on the desk, and felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Mason had warned him to stay vigilant, to never go into the woods at night, but the warning had come too late. Ethan had already stepped into the darkness, and now there was no turning back. As he sank into the chair, exhaustion overtaking him, Ethan realized that Station 21 was far more than just a remote outpost. It was a trap, a place where something ancient and malevolent prowled the woods, and he was now caught in its sights. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it that low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the cabin. Ethan's hand tightened around the handle of his hunting knife, the only thing standing between him and whatever was out there. He knew he couldn't stay inside forever. Sooner or later, he would have to face whatever was watching him. And when that time came, he could only hope he'd be ready. But deep down, he knew the forest had other plans for him. The rain had finally ceased, leaving the forest shrouded in a thick, damp mist that clung to everything like a cold, wet blanket. Ethan sat at the small wooden table in the cabin, staring out the window at the creeping fog. His mind replayed the events of the previous day, the disappearance of the hiker, the strange symbols carved into the trees, and the haunting growl that had echoed through the woods. It was the kind of sound that burrowed deep into your bones and settled there, a lingering reminder that something was out there, something very much aware of him. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in on him, that the trees were somehow watching, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He'd spent the better part of the morning pacing the small cabin, trying to decide his next step. The rational part of his mind told him to stay put, to wait for backup, or at least for the radio to start working again. But he knew that waiting might not be an option. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer, and it wasn't going to wait for him to be ready. The memory of the shadowy figure in the forest haunted him, its form indistinct and shifting like smoke, yet undeniably massive. The way it had moved with a fluidity that defied the natural order was unlike anything he'd ever seen in his years as a ranger. And then there was the growl, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from all around him, reverberating through the trees and the very earth beneath his feet. He couldn't just sit here and do nothing. He needed to know what he was dealing with. Ethan grabbed his flashlight, knife, and a flare gun from the supply closet, strapping them to his belt before heading out the door. The mist was thicker now, the air heavy with moisture, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees loomed like tall, silent sentinels, their branches interlocking to form a dense canopy overhead. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into another world, one where the rules of reality were bent and twisted just like the trees themselves. He retraced his steps from the day before, following the same path he'd taken in search of the missing hiker. The forest seemed different today, the familiar landmarks obscured by the fog, the ground softer and more treacherous beneath his boots. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. But even those sounds felt muted, swallowed by the mist. As he walked, Ethan couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. It was more than just paranoia. It was a visceral, gut-wrenching certainty that something was out there, tracking his every move. He stopped periodically, scanning the trees, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of the shadowy figure. But the forest offered no clues, only an impenetrable wall of fog and silence. After what felt like hours, he reached the clearing where he'd found the hiker's boot and the strange symbols carved into the tree. The boot was still there, half buried in the mud, the bloodstain on its side now a dark, ominous reminder of what had happened. The symbols on the tree were just as he remembered them, sharp, intricate lines that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. Ethan knelt beside the tree, examining the symbols more closely. They were unlike any he'd seen before, not part of any language or code he could recognize. They seemed ancient, almost primal, as if they had been carved by something, or someone, that understood a language far older than humanity itself. A sudden rustling in the bushes behind him made him freeze. Slowly he turned, his hand going to the flashlight at his belt. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. His heart pounded in his chest as he strained to see through the fog, but the thick mist obscured everything beyond a few feet. He clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the mist like a knife. The light revealed nothing but more trees, their gnarled trunks twisted and deformed. The forest was silent once more, the only sound his own breathing, loud and uneven in the stillness. And then he saw it, a shadowy figure moving between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch and contract as it moved. Its form was vague, as if it was made of the very mist that surrounded it, blending seamlessly into the fog. The flashlight beam flickered as it passed over the figure, the light seeming to waver and bend around it. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The figure paused as if it sensed the light and slowly turned toward him. For a moment, they were locked in a silent standoff, the air thick with tension. The figure didn't move closer, but Ethan could feel its gaze on him, cold and calculating. It wasn't just watching him, it was studying him, assessing him like a predator does its prey. With a trembling hand, Ethan raised the flashlight higher, trying to get a better look at the figure's face. But the mist distorted everything, blurring the edges of the creature's form. All he could make out was a vague impression of something humanoid, but twisted and wrong, its features lost in shadow. Suddenly, the figure began to move again, its steps slow and deliberate, each one taking it closer to the edge of the clearing. Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized it was circling him, staying just out of the beam of his flashlight. It moved with a grace that was almost unnatural, gliding through the mist without making a sound. Ethan took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The figure continued its slow circle, closing in on him with each pass. His grip tightened on the flashlight, his other hand hovering near the flare gun at his belt. He had no idea what good it would do, but it was the only weapon he had. The figure paused again, just a few feet away from him now. Ethan could feel the air around him grow colder, as if the creature was drawing the heat out of the very atmosphere. His breath formed small clouds of vapor in front of him, each one hanging in the air like a silent scream. Then, without warning, the figure lunged at him, its form elongating, stretching out impossibly as it reached for him. Ethan barely had time to react. He stumbled backward, falling to the ground as the creature passed over him, its shadow enveloping him in darkness. He fumbled for the flare gun, his hands shaking as he aimed it at the figure. The creature paused, looming over him, its presence oppressive and suffocating. Ethan pulled the trigger and the flare shot out with a bright flash, filling the clearing with a blinding red light. The figure recoiled, its form flickering and distorting as the light struck it. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw something more, a glimpse of eyes, cold and malevolent, staring down at him from the shadow's depths. The flare hit the ground and sputtered out, the light fading as quickly as it had come. The figure vanished with it, dissolving into the mist like a wisp of smoke. Ethan scrambled to his feet, the flare gun clattering to the ground beside him. The clearing was empty again, the only sound his own ragged breathing. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his heart racing, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The fog began to lift, the sunlight piercing through in thin golden beams that seemed to chase away the shadows. But the fear remained, rooted deep within him like a dark seed. Ethan knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that whatever he had seen was no mere hallucination. The figure was real, and it was still out there, lurking in the forest, watching him. He could feel its presence lingering at the edge of his awareness, a constant, oppressive weight on his mind. With trembling hands, he picked up the flare gun and tucked it back into his belt. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving him feeling drained and weak. He needed to get back to the cabin, to regroup, to figure out what to do next. But as he turned to leave, his eyes caught on the symbols carved into the tree once more. They seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as if reacting to the presence of the creature. Ethan felt a cold dread settle over him as he realized that the symbols weren't just random markings, they were a warning that he had ignored. He turned away from the tree and began to walk, his pace quickening as he made his way back through the forest. The shadows seemed to stretch out toward him, the mist closing in. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not until he was safely back inside the cabin, with the door locked and the darkness kept at bay. But even then, Ethan knew that safety was an illusion. The figure had found him, and it wasn't going to stop until it had him. He was no longer just a park ranger doing his job. He was prey, and the hunt had only just begun. As he reached the clearing where the cabin stood, Ethan glanced over his shoulder one last time, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing there, watching him. But the forest was still, the mist beginning to dissipate in the warm afternoon sun. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had imagined it all. But deep down, he knew better. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. Ethan stepped inside the cabin and locked the door, leaning heavily against it as he tried to steady his breathing. The room was silent, the only sound the faint creak of the wooden walls. He felt the weight of the day's events pressing down on him, the realization that he was facing something far beyond his understanding. He sank into the chair at the table, his hands still trembling as he stared at the map spread out before him. The map that now felt useless, as if it couldn't possibly convey the true danger that lay hidden in these woods. Ethan knew he needed to think, to plan his next move carefully. But all he could focus on was the cold, hard truth that had settled in his mind. Whatever was out there, it was watching him, and it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of that same low, guttural growl that had haunted him since his arrival. Ethan closed his eyes, knowing that this was only the beginning. Ethan awoke the next morning to the sound of rain pattering softly against the cabin's roof, a dull gray light filtering through the windows. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind like a persistent shadow, making it hard to distinguish between the remnants of his nightmares and the reality he had faced in the woods. The memory of the shadowy figure, the guttural growl, and the symbols carved into the trees haunted him, gnawing at his nerves. He sat at the small table, staring down at the map of the park, tracing his finger along the trail he had taken the day before. There was a time when this map had made sense to him, each trail and landmark a clear guide through the wilderness. But now, after everything he had seen, it felt incomplete, as though it only hinted at the darker, hidden layers of the forest that weren't marked on any chart. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes and causing the trees to sway. As Ethan sipped his coffee, he thought about the strange symbols he had found and the ancient malevolent presence that seemed to be connected to them. He needed answers, something more tangible than his own fear and suspicion. The name Mrs. Havisham came to mind, an elderly woman who lived just on the outskirts of the park. She was something of a local legend herself, known for her deep knowledge of the park's history and the old stories passed down through generations. Ethan had spoken to her briefly when he first arrived, and she had warned him to be careful in the woods. But he had brushed it off as the usual talk of superstitions. Now, he wasn't so sure. If anyone could shed light on the strange occurrences at Station 21, it would be her. Ethan finished his coffee, grabbed his jacket, and prepared to make the trek to Mrs. Havisham's cottage. The mist had cleared, but the sky remained overcast, the clouds heavy and dark. He strapped on his gear, making sure to bring his flashlight and flare gun, just in case, before stepping out into the damp morning air. The trail to Mrs. Havisham's cottage was well trodden, a narrow dirt path winding through the trees. The forest felt different today, not as oppressive as the day before, but still unsettling in its silence. The birds were quiet, the only sounds the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional gust of wind that sent a shiver through the trees. Ethan kept a wary eye on his surroundings, half expecting the shadowy figure to reappear at any moment. But the forest remained still, and after an hour of walking, he arrived at a small clearing where Mrs. Havisham's cottage stood. It was a quaint, old building with a thatched roof and ivy creeping up the stone walls. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the scent of burning wood filled the air. He knocked on the wooden door, and after a moment it creaked open to reveal Mrs. Havisham, her sharp blue eyes peering up at him from beneath a tangle of silver hair. She was small and frail-looking, but there was a strength in her gaze that belied her age. "Ethan Cole," she said, her voice raspy but warm. "I was wondering when you'd come knocking. Come in before you let all the warmth out." Ethan stepped inside, the warmth of the cottage a welcome relief from the cold dampness outside. The interior was cozy with old wooden furniture, shelves lined with books, and a fire crackling in the hearth. The smell of herbs and something sweet, maybe freshly baked bread, lingered in the air. Mrs. Havisham motioned for him to sit at the kitchen table, where she had already set out a pot of tea and 2 cups. She poured them both a cup, her hands steady despite her age, and then sat down across from him, watching him with an expectant gaze. "I take it you're not here just for a social visit," she said, a slight smile playing at the corners of her lips. Ethan nodded, his thoughts still clouded by the events of the previous days. "You could say that. Something strange has been happening out there. I've seen things I can't explain." Mrs. Havisham's expression grew serious, the smile fading. "The woods have always been strange, Ranger Cole. They were strange long before the park was established, long before the first settlers arrived. I found symbols carved into a tree," Ethan said, leaning forward. "And then I saw something that shouldn't exist. A figure, tall and dark, moving through the mist. It wasn't human, but it was watching me, tracking me." Mrs. Havisham's eyes narrowed as she listened, her hands clasped around her teacup. "You've seen the Watcher," she said quietly. "The spirit of the woods. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But seeing it and surviving to tell the tale, well, that's a rare thing." "The Watcher," Ethan echoed, the name sending a chill down his spine. "What is it? And what do those symbols mean?" Mrs. Havisham sighed, her gaze distant as she stared into the flames of the hearth. "The Watcher is as old as the forest itself, maybe older. The stories say it was once a guardian, a protector of the land, long before people ever set foot here. But something changed. No one knows exactly what. Some say the settlers angered it when they cut down the sacred trees to build their homes. Others say it was a curse brought upon the land by those who sought to control it." She paused, her eyes darkening. "The symbols you saw, they're part of an ancient language, one that's been lost to time. The settlers used it in their rituals, trying to appease the Watcher or bind it to their will. But the Watcher doesn't bow to anyone. Those symbols don't protect, they trap. They mark places where the Watcher's power is strongest, where it can reach into our world more easily." Ethan felt a cold dread settle over him as he listened. "I've seen what it can do. There was a hiker. He's gone. And I found a boot with blood on it. Whatever this thing is, it's dangerous." Mrs. Havisham nodded solemnly. "The Watcher doesn't take kindly to intruders. It sees the forest as its domain, and anyone who enters is fair game. It stalks them, studies them, and when the time is right, it strikes. The hiker you found, he's likely already been claimed. And if you're not careful, you could be next." Ethan's grip tightened around his teacup, the warmth doing little to ease the chill in his bones. "Is there any way to stop it? To protect myself?" Mrs. Havisham looked at him with a mixture of pity and resignation. There are ways to keep it at bay for a time. The settlers used to leave offerings at the base of certain trees, food, trinkets, things of value. They believed it would appease the watcher, keep it satisfied, but it's not a permanent solution. The watcher isn't a creature you can bargain with. It's something far older, far more powerful than anything we can truly understand. Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together everything she had told him. What about the cabin, the symbols carved into the trees nearby? Could they be keeping it away? Mrs. Havisham shook her head slowly. Those symbols might be giving you a false sense of security. The watcher is drawn to them, not repelled by them. They're markers, reminders of the old ways, of the people who tried and failed to control it. Your cabin is likely in one of its favorite hunting grounds. Ethan's heart sank. So what do? I can't just leave, I have a job to do. Mrs. Havisham studied him for a long moment, her eyes piercing. If you're determined to stay, then you need to be prepared. The watcher will come for you sooner or later. You must be vigilant, always aware of your surroundings. Don't go into the woods at night, and never, ever listen to the whispers. The whispers? Ethan asked, a sense of foreboding settling over him. The watcher can't speak in words, but it can communicate in other ways, she explained. It can twist the sounds of the forest, make you hear things that aren't there. It will try to lure you into the trees, lead you deeper into its territory. Once you're in its grasp, there's no escaping. Ethan felt the weight of her words pressing down on him, a heavy, suffocating realization that he was dealing with something far beyond his control. The Watcher wasn't just a figment of his imagination or some local legend. It was real, and it was out there, watching him, waiting for its chance to strike. "Is there anything else I should know?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Mrs. Havisham hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "There's one more thing. If you see it again, if it comes for you, don't run. Running will only make it more determined, more dangerous. Stand your ground, show no fear. It's said that the Watcher respects strength, that it may spare those who don't flee, but it's only a rumor. No one really knows what the Watcher wants or why it does what it does." Ethan nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation settling in. He had come to Station 21 thinking it would be just another assignment, another stretch of time spent in the solitude of the wilderness. But this was different. The forest wasn't just a place to be patrolled and protected. It was alive, and it had a dark, ancient force that was far beyond his understanding. He finished his tea, the warmth doing little to ease the cold fear that had taken hold of him. Mrs. Havisham reached across the table and placed a hand on his, her grip surprisingly firm. "You're a good man, Ethan Cole," she said softly, "but you're in over your head. Be careful, and don't let your pride lead you into a fight you can't win." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding again. "Thank you, Mrs. Havisham, for everything." She smiled sadly. "I'll pray for you, Ethan. You'll need all the help you can get." With that, he rose from the table, his mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. He thanked her again, and then stepped out into the cold, damp air, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The trail back to the cabin felt longer, the shadows deeper, the trees more menacing. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive with unseen eyes, that the Watcher was out there, just beyond the edge of his vision, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When he finally reached the cabin, he bolted the door behind him, his heart still pounding. The day had barely begun, but already it felt like he was running out of time. The Watcher was watching, waiting, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before their paths crossed again. He stared at the map spread out on the table, the symbols etched into the bark of the trees now making a terrible kind of sense. The Watcher was real, and it was coming for him. And when it did, Ethan would be ready. He had to be, because out here in the depths of Greystone National Park, there were no second chances. Ethan woke with a start, the silence of the cabin broken only by the steady thrum of his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He lay still for a moment, listening, but the night remained quiet. No growls, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive quiet of a forest holding its breath. He rubbed his eyes and glanced at the clock on the wall. 4:30 a.m. Too early to be awake, yet too late to go back to sleep. The events of the past few days had weighed heavily on him, and the conversation with Mrs. Havisham lingered in his mind. Her words a grim reminder of the ancient power that lurked just beyond the safety of the cabin walls. Ethan pushed himself out of bed and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. Everything looked peaceful, almost serene. But Ethan knew better. The forest had a way of hiding its true nature, masking the dangers that lurked within. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his fingers twisting the knob with increasing desperation. The radio crackled again, this time followed by a burst of what sounded like a faint voice, distant and garbled. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He adjusted the frequency, trying to lock onto the signal. For a brief moment, the static cleared, and a voice came through, distorted but recognizable. "Station 21, Ethan Cole, can you hear me?" He leaned in, almost pressing his ear to the speaker. "Yes, I can hear you. This is Ethan Cole at Station 21. Can you hear me?" The voice crackled, breaking apart into fragments. "Ethan, danger. Watcher, get out. Now." And then, just as quickly as it had come, the signal was gone, swallowed by the relentless static. Ethan frantically turned the dial, but the voice didn't return. He slammed his fist on the desk in frustration, the echo of the message looping in his mind. "The Watcher, get out, now." Ethan's hand trembled as he switched off the radio, the dread settling back into his bones. The message was clear. He was in danger, and whoever had tried to warn him was either too far away to help or had met the same fate as the missing hiker. He couldn't stay here, isolated and alone, waiting for the Watcher to make its move. But leaving wasn't an option either. The forest was vast, and the path out of the park would take days to navigate, even if he could manage to find it again in the twisted landscape. No, he was trapped, just as Mrs. Havisham had said, trapped in the Watcher's domain, with no one to rely on but himself. He paced the cabin, trying to form a plan. He had to be proactive, had to find a way to protect himself. The flare gun, the bear spray, they seemed woefully inadequate against a force as ancient and malevolent as the Watcher. He needed something more, something that could give him an edge, even if it was only temporary. His eyes fell on the box of supplies he had brought with him, a mix of standard ranger gear and personal belongings. He rummaged through it, pulling out a heavy-duty flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, and a few other essentials. As he did, his hand brushed against something hard and metallic at the bottom of the box. Ethan frowned and pulled it out, a small portable signal booster he had nearly forgotten about. It was a gift from a friend, designed to amplify weak radio signals in remote areas. He hadn't thought he would need it, but now it seemed like his best chance of reaching someone outside the park. He quickly set it up next to the radio, connecting the cables and adjusting the settings. The booster hummed to life, a small green light blinking steadily. He turned the radio back on, the static immediately filling the cabin again. But this time it was different, sharper, more focused. He fine-tuned the frequency, praying for a miracle. "Station 21, this is Ethan Cole," he spoke into the microphone, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "If anyone can hear me, please respond." The static continued for a few agonizing seconds, and then, faintly, a voice emerged. "Ethan, this is HQ. What's your status?" Relief washed over him like a wave. He had made contact. He wasn't alone. "This is Cole," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm at Station 21. There's something in the woods, something dangerous. I've lost contact with everyone else. The hiker is missing, and there's this creature. I think it's hunting me. I need help." The voice on the other end was barely audible, but it carried a tone of urgency. "Understood, Cole. We're sending a team. Get out. Stay inside. At all costs." The connection began to crackle, the voice fading in and out. Ethan gripped the microphone tighter, his pulse quickening. "I can't just stay inside. I need to know what's out there. Is there anything you can tell me? Anything that can help?" The response was fragmented, as if the signal was being pulled apart by the very air around him. "Watcher, ancient, stay, don't. Door." The static surged, drowning out the last of the message. Ethan's heart sank as the connection was lost completely. The green light on the signal booster flickered, then went dark. Whatever tenuous link he had managed to establish was gone. He stared at the radio in disbelief, his mind racing. HQ had confirmed his worst fears. The Watcher was real, and it was dangerous. But they had told him to stay inside, to not open the door. Why? What did they know that he didn't? What was this creature capable of? The cabin suddenly felt smaller, more claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in around him. He couldn't just sit here and wait for the Watcher to make its move. He had to do something, anything, to take control of the situation. Ethan checked his gear one more time, making sure everything was in place. The flare gun, the flashlight, the knife, they were all ready, but they felt insignificant against the looming threat. He needed to be smarter, to think like a ranger and use his surroundings to his advantage. He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. The forest was still and quiet, the mist hanging low over the ground. Ethan scanned the tree line, his senses on high alert. The Watcher was out there somewhere watching him, waiting for the right moment. Ethan moved cautiously around the cabin, checking the perimeter. The old rusted traps set up by previous rangers were still there, useless against something as powerful as the Watcher. But the symbols carved into the trees near the cabin, they might be his only hope. Mrs. Havisham had warned him that the symbols were dangerous, that they attracted the Watcher instead of repelling it. But Ethan had a different idea. If the Watcher was drawn to the symbols, maybe he could use them to his advantage, lure it into a trap of his own making. He quickly went to work, using a piece of chalk to replicate the symbols on the trees, amplifying their presence. He didn't fully understand the ancient language, but he knew enough to mimic the patterns, hoping it would have the desired effect. As he finished the last symbol, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air around him grew colder, the shadows deeper. The forest seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if responding to the symbols he had carved. Ethan stepped back, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He knew the Watcher was near. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and causing the trees to sway. Ethan's hand tightened around the handle of his knife, the cold metal comforting in his grip. He scanned the tree line again, searching for any sign of movement. And then he saw it, a dark figure moving through the mist just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was the same figure he had seen before, tall and shadowy, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. The Watcher. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched the figure approach, its movements slow and deliberate. It was heading straight for the cabin, drawn by the symbols he had carved. His plan was working. He had lured the Watcher into the open. But as the creature drew closer, Ethan's confidence began to waver. The Watcher was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Its presence was overwhelming, oppressive, as if it carried the weight of centuries of darkness and pain. The very air around it seemed to warp and bend, distorting reality. Ethan took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The Watcher paused at the edge of the clearing, its form flickering in and out of focus. It was studying him, assessing him with a cold, calculating gaze. The wind howled through the trees, and for a moment Ethan thought he heard whispers, faint and distant, carried on the wind. He remembered Mrs. Havisham's warning, never listen to the whispers. But the words were so soft, so enticing, that he found himself straining to hear them. The Watcher took another step forward, its shadow stretching across the ground like a living thing. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the creature's eyes, dark, hollow voids, locked onto his. And then, without warning, the Watcher lunged at him. Ethan fired the flare gun, the bright red light exploding into the air with a deafening crack. The Watcher recoiled, its form flickering and distorting in the light. For a brief moment, it seemed to lose its shape, dissolving into a mass of swirling shadows. Ethan didn't waste any time. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the ground as he sprinted toward the cabin. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with dark, twisted thoughts. He pushed them away, focusing only on reaching the safety of the cabin. He burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him and locking it tight. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the flare outside. Ethan leaned against the door, his chest heaving, his mind racing. The Watcher was still out there, but it was angry now. He could feel its presence pressing against the walls of the cabin, like a storm building on the horizon. The whispers were all around him, seeping through the cracks in the wood, invading his thoughts. Ethan clenched his fists, fighting the urge to listen, to give in to the darkness. He couldn't afford to lose control now, not when he was so close. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The cabin creaked and groaned under the weight of the Watcher's presence, but it held. For now, Ethan knew this wasn't over. The Watcher was relentless, and it would keep coming until it got what it wanted. But he was prepared now, ready to face whatever came next. He moved to the table where the map lay spread out. He had one more trick up his sleeve, one final gambit that might just give him the edge he needed. He just hoped it would be enough. Outside, the wind howled, and the shadows pressed closer, but Ethan was no longer afraid. He was determined, focused, ready to do whatever it took to survive. The Watcher had underestimated him, and now it was his turn to strike. But deep down, Ethan knew the truth. The forest was ancient, powerful, and it had already chosen its prey, and he was alone.